Come closer, you've been feeling it too, haven't you? That subtle shift, that gnawing emptiness where comfort used to be. It starts small, a whisper in the quiet corners of your mind, but it grows. This is not just a story, it's a warning. A tale of a hunger that feeds on touch itself. Join us in the shadows, subscribe to never miss a nightmare. Now listen closely, for the first fissures are appearing. Elias Thorne, a master of form, knew the world through his fingertips. His studio, a quiet haven in the city's heart, was an extension of his soul. Every curve of clay, every grain of wood spoke to him. Touch was his language, his sight, his very connection to life. He lived to create, to pull beauty from the raw earth with his hands. One quiet afternoon, working with a new batch of clay, Elias felt it. A fleeting wrongness. Not a chill, not a prickle, but a sensation of emptiness, a phantom hunger that wasn't his own. It was a void where the solid, comforting clay should have been, a brief, unsettling absence in his palms. He paused, shaking his head. Fatigue, he thought, or perhaps a nerve pinch, a trick of the mind. He tried to rationalize it, to push away the uncanny feeling. But you've felt that too, haven't you? That shiver of knowing something is off, even when you try to deny it. The sensation returned, stronger this time. He was touching an old, smooth river stone, a comforting weight he'd kept for years. But instead of solace, it left him with a lingering, empty ache in his fingertips, as if the stone had somehow drawn a part of him away. Later, his assistant helped him move a finished sculpture. Their hands brushed for a moment. Elias couldn't see, but he felt a subtle shift, a coldness. He noticed a slight, unsettling pallor on the assistant's face, a vacant look that unnerved him, though he couldn't say why. He found himself subconsciously avoiding certain textures. The rough weave of a blanket, the cool surface of his marble table. A subtle, growing aversion to the very things that once brought him comfort and inspiration. It was a quiet dread, a new, unwelcome guest in his sanctuary. The phantom hunger, initially fleeting, now lingered. A gnawing echo in his hands that seemed to deepen the more he focused on it. Was his unique sensitivity, his greatest gift, now betraying him? Was it twisting his perception, turning his strength into a weakness? He attempted to cleanse his hands, washing them meticulously. Hot water, cold water, soap. But the sensation persisted, an internal itch that water could not soothe. A feeling of being subtly, imperceptibly starved at the points of contact, as if his skin itself craved something. While sculpting, he found his hands hesitating, recoiling from the clay as if it were too cold or too vast. A sense of something being drawn from him, rather than him imparting form to it. His creative energy felt siphoned, replaced by a strange, empty echo. He called a trusted, retired mentor, a fellow sculptor. He described his odd symptoms, carefully avoiding his growing fear. His mentor listened, kind but confused, offering no comfort, only vague suggestions of rest. Elias felt utterly alone with his creeping dread. The feeling began to spread beyond his fingertips, subtly creeping up his forearms. His skin felt thin, almost porous, as if something was trying to leach through. It was a slow, insidious invasion, a sensation of being hollowed out from within. He tried to lose himself in his work, to forget the strange sensations. But the clay felt alien, dead in his hands, resisting his will. It seemed to absorb his focus, leaving him feeling drained, not creatively invigorated, but utterly empty. He found himself subconsciously clenching his fists, as if trying to squeeze away the feeling of internal emptiness. But it only intensified the phantom hunger in his joints, a dull, aching throb that echoed the void within. He prepared a meal, a simple, comforting dish. But when he held the fork or the glass, the phantom hunger in his hands made the actual food feel distant, unsatisfying, as if his hands were too full of absence to truly grip sustenance, to truly taste it. A small, unexpected tremor passed through his body when he brushed against a rough wall. The phantom hunger flared up his arm, making his stomach clench even though he wasn't truly hungry. It was a visceral reaction to a non-existent threat. He tried to describe the sensation to himself, to give it a name. A hollow echo, he thought, or a cold burning. He struggled to find words for a hunger that had no physical source, a craving that could not be sated by food. It was a new, terrifying language of pain. The world of textures, once his sanctuary, began to feel subtly hostile, each touch a potential trigger for this deep, phantom craving. He found himself wary of his own environment, of the very surfaces that once brought him joy. His world was turning against him. He began to notice a faint, almost imperceptible hum or pressure in the air around certain objects or in specific areas of his studio, a sound only his highly sensitive hearing could pick up. It was like the world itself was breathing, a slow, hungry inhale. Elias forced himself to touch a cherished, smooth marble sculpture he created years ago, expecting comfort. But instead, the phantom hunger flared intensely, making the beautiful stone feel like a source of pure, aching void. It was a betrayal of beauty itself. He contemplated seeking medical help, but the strangeness of his symptoms made him hesitate. How could he describe a hunger that wasn't for food? He feared he'd be dismissed or misunderstood, leaving him feeling utterly alone with this creeping dread, this silent torment. He tried to focus on his breathing, on the familiar rhythm of his own body. A grounding exercise, but even the air against his skin seemed to carry a faint, insidious whisper of that unseen hunger. It was everywhere, seeping into every pore, every breath. As night fell, the studio, once a place of creation and peace, felt less like a refuge and more like a chamber, a place where the very air, the very surfaces, were waiting to trigger this bizarre internal agony. The silence was no longer comforting, but a shroud. He reached out for his guide dog, a comforting presence, a loyal companion, but he hesitated. A sudden, primal fear stopped his hand midair, a horrifying premonition that even this most pure connection, this innocent touch, might become tainted. He couldn't risk it. Elias finally fell asleep, not from tiredness, but from a profound mental exhaustion. His hands rested on the sheets, twitching almost imperceptibly, as if still trying to grasp something that wasn't there. The last thing he felt before sleep took him was the subtle, pervasive thrum of the phantom hunger, not just in his hands, but now a faint, undeniable pulse spreading up his arms. A silent, ravenous promise of more to come. The phantom hunger was a dull, constant ache now. It was no longer a fleeting ghost, but a relentless presence, a gnawing emptiness in Elias's hands and forearms. Waking was not a release from it, but a deepening embrace. Even the simple act of touching his bed sheets felt wrong, as if the fabric itself was drawing something vital from him. What if the very act of existing, of touching the world, was slowly consuming you? He tried to eat breakfast. The cool metal of the silverware, the smooth ceramic of the bowl, Even the food itself felt strange, empty, unresponsive. It was as if the hunger in his hands wasn't just a sensation, but a real force, sucking the substance from everything he touched. His hands felt like black holes, absorbing reality. Each touch was a confirmation of the growing horror. The oatmeal, usually a comfort, felt like a void. He couldn't feel its warmth properly, its texture. It was just there, a thing his hands couldn't connect with. Have you ever felt utterly disconnected from something so simple, so necessary? His guide dog, usually a warm, constant comfort, seemed different. Elias reached out to pat its head, but the dog moved slightly, a subtle hesitation. Was it his imagination, or did even his loyal companion sense the wrongness? When his hand finally connected, Elias felt a faint, cold ripple through the dog's fur. It wasn't a shiver or a tremor from the dog. It was something else. A deep unease settled in his gut. Could it be spreading, even through his touch, to something so innocent? Clara, his young assistant, arrived. She spoke of his pallor, his distractedness, her voice laced with concern. Then, without thinking, she reached out, her hand brushing his arm. A simple, caring gesture, but for Elias, it was a trigger. An immediate, sharp flare of the hunger shot up his arm. It was like a jolt of ice, a searing emptiness. He pulled his arm back instinctively, a strangled gasp catching in his throat. Clara paused, her hand frozen in the air. He couldn't explain it, couldn't voice the terror that had just gripped him. He tried to work. He had to. But the clay, once his friend, now felt overtly hostile, devouring, dead. It was no longer a medium to be shaped, but a thing that fought him, that seemed to suck his will away. What happens when your passion, your very purpose, turns against you? Sculpting became an agonizing battle. Every attempt to mold the clay provoked a fresh wave of the phantom craving. His hands, once so sure, now trembled. Each touch was a small act of self-torture, a constant reminder of the void growing within him. He began to notice patterns. Specific objects, certain areas in his studio triggered stronger waves of the hunger, a particular workbench, the handle of a frequently used tool, a patch of worn floorboard. They were like focal points, anchors for this unseen dread. Elias started to document his experiences. A tactile journal using raised textures and different materials to map the hungry areas. But the irony was cruel. The very act of touching his notes, of mapping the horror, only made the hunger worse. He was feeding it by trying to understand it. He tried to research rare neurological conditions, strange sensory disorders, but nothing fit. The hunger was too specific, too alien, too much like a parasitic entity. It wasn't a malfunction of his body, it was an invasion. He overheard news reports. Strange, inexplicable localized sensory fatigue, unexplained malaise affecting people in other parts of the city, especially those in service roles, people who touched others often. A shiver ran down his spine. It wasn't just him, it was spreading. A growing paranoia took root. He became hyper-aware of every brush, every accidental touch. Every surface was a potential vector, every person a potential carrier. His world, once a tapestry of safe textures, was now a minefield of unseen danger. Clara spoke of an odd numbness in her fingers. She dismissed it as pins and needles, a common ache from working with clay, but Elias knew. He recognized the early signs, the hunger. It was spreading. From him, or was he simply its first victim? The terror was clear. Clara had worked on a shared sculpture, her hands touching the same clay, the same tools as his. He knew, with a certainty that chilled him to the bone, that the numbness was the hunger taking root in her. His greatest fear was real. He started to distance himself from Clara, made excuses. His need for her assistance, for human connection, warred with the terrifying knowledge of what his touch might be doing. To save her, he had to push her away. What greater horror is there than to become a danger to those you care for? A chilling realization dawned on him. The entity wasn't just siphoning sensation. It was implanting its own perverse hunger. His own sense of touch, his most precious gift, was being weaponized. It was turning him into a conduit for its insatiable craving. He recounted a dream to himself, a dream of his hands endlessly reaching, grasping, but never quite filling a vast, dark, empty space. It was a chilling echo of his waking torment, a mirror of the void that was becoming him. The faint hum he'd perceived earlier became more distinct, a low, guttural vibration. It seemed to emanate from the very materials he touched, a resonant frequency of famine. The world itself was groaning with this unseen hunger. He had to know. He tested his theory. Deliberately, he touched a highly charged object, one that had caused him intense discomfort before. The wave of phantom hunger that washed over him was so intense it brought him to his knees, his gut clenching with an invisible agony. It was real. He began to visualize the hunger, a dark, invisible current flowing from objects through his hands and into his core, a profound invasion of his sensory being. It wasn't just affecting him, it was becoming him. He tried to engage his other senses to compensate, listening more intently, smelling with greater focus. But the absence of true touch left him feeling profoundly disconnected, a floating ghost in his own body. He was losing his anchor to reality. Elias desperately attempted to create a new sculpture, something to express the consuming void. But every attempt to mold the clay resulted in shapes that felt hollow, starved, utterly devoid of life. A terrifying mirror of his own internal state. His art, his escape, was now a reflection of his torment. Clara left for the day, and Elias's relief was immediately replaced by a crushing guilt. He was pulling away from the only person who still came close for her own protection. He reached out, not for comfort, but for the most hungry object he'd identified, clenching it tightly, bracing himself as the phantom hunger flooded him, confirming the horrifying truth. This wasn't a symptom. It was a spreading contagion, and he was at its epicenter. The phantom hunger was no longer just a feeling. It was a constant torment, a dull ache in Elias's hands and forearms that sharpened with every touch. Waking up meant facing this gnawing void, a relentless presence. Even the air felt thick with it. What if your very existence became a source of pain? He tried gloves, thick ones, hoping to create a barrier. But the hunger still permeated, a dull throb through the fabric. It was proof this wasn't just a surface affliction. It was deeper, more insidious. Would you have dared to keep them off, to face the raw agony? Then he saw Clara's hands. Her fingertips had a subtle, almost translucent quality, as if life was being leached from them. Her movements grew hesitant, her usual energy gone. The sight chilled him to his core. It was spreading. He retreated further into his studio, canceling appointments, isolating himself. But the very air, the familiar surfaces, now felt imbued with that insidious hunger. His sanctuary had become a cage, every wall humming with unseen dread. There was no escape. The hum he'd perceived earlier now had distinct patterns, almost a low, resonant growl. It changed pitch depending on the hunger level of nearby objects or people. The world was speaking to him, and its language was starvation. Through his screen reader, Elias stumbled upon an old news article. It described a similar sensory blight in a remote, ancient town centuries ago, vaguely referencing a consuming void that spread through touch. History was repeating, but this time it was personal. Elias began to connect the dots. The tactile hunger wasn't just siphoning sensation. It was corrupting the very concept of touch, turning connection into consumption. Every handshake, every embrace, a slow act of devouring, a terrifying truth. He experienced harrowing phantom self-cannibalism. He perceived his own skin as an unsatisfying meal, an internal decay, a horrifying urge to fill the void by consuming himself. What do you do when your own body turns into a source of torment? Clara, increasingly withdrawn and pale, finally admitted her hands felt cold and empty. She'd been suffering constant, inexplicable stomach pains, even after eating. Elias's worst fears were confirmed. The hunger had found her too. He began to create a map of hunger in his studio, marking objects with different degrees of affliction. A desperate attempt to understand and control the spread. But mapping the horror only made it more real, more pervasive. He realized the entity was ancient, vast. It wasn't just affecting individuals, but the very fabric of reality's tactile sense, spreading through invisible filaments of perceived connection. A silent, devouring force consuming the world from within. The sounds of the city outside his loft window began to change. Fewer cheerful interactions, more muted exchanges, a creeping quietness in human contact. The city itself was holding its breath, or perhaps slowly starving. Elias's other senses were heightened to an unbearable degree. He heard the subtle sounds of the hunger in the air, smelled a faint, metallic tang on infected surfaces, tasted the bitterness of absence. The world was screaming its hunger. He considered destroying his sculptures, his life's work. Feared they were now vessels for the spreading affliction, but the thought of erasing his existence through touch was too much. How can you destroy what defines you when that very act is corrupted? He had a terrifying vision, not with his eyes, but with his touch, feeling the entire city as a vast, interconnected, starving organism, pulsing with the pervasive hunger, a network of suffering, and he was a part of it. Elias noticed strange etchings or patterns forming on the surfaces of objects highly affected by the hunger. Intricate lines that seemed to trace pathways of consumption, visible only through extreme tactile focus. The hunger left its mark. His guide dog began to whimper whenever Elias tried to pet it, pulling away with clear distress. A heart-wrenching loss of his last uncorrupted tactile comfort. Even the purest connection was now tainted. He was truly alone. He tried to explain the tactile hunger to Clara, his voice strained with desperation. But her vacant, listless response suggested she was already too deeply affected to fully grasp the horror. She was slipping away, consumed from within. Elias found himself instinctively avoiding any physical contact with the ground, feeling an overwhelming urge to float, to sever all tactile connection to the earth itself. The world was a trap, every surface a potential agony. He made a desperate phone call to a renowned scientist he'd found during his research, someone who had dismissed the ancient sensory blight as folklore, leaving a rambling, frantic voicemail. Would anyone believe him? Would it matter? The phantom hunger began to cause genuine physical pain, a sharp, internal cramping that mirrored the agony of extreme starvation, even though he ate regularly. His body was betraying him, mimicking a void that food could not fill. Elias noticed his own hands were starting to show the same translucent, almost skeletal quality as Clara's, the life draining from his primary source of connection. His very being was being consumed, piece by agonizing piece. He attempted to create a sculpture that resisted the hunger, using materials he hoped were immune. But every touch felt like a direct invitation for the entity to consume more. His art, once his salvation, was now another battleground. He felt an unnerving pull, a strange magnetic force drawing him towards a specific, very old, intricately carved wooden chest in a forgotten corner of his studio. A chilling sensation that it was a focal point of the hunger, a source or a vessel. As Clara finally left, her steps slow and hesitant, Elias felt a profound, terrifying emptiness, not just from her departure, but from the horrifying realization that her touch, and his, was now a weapon, slowly devouring them both and countless others in the city from the inside out. The hunger was everywhere, and it was only growing. The phantom hunger was a screaming void now. Elias clutched a piece of clay, the familiar texture a torment. His studio, once his sanctuary, had become a chamber of torture. Every surface, every tool, every material radiated that agonizing emptiness. What if the very act of creating became a source of unbearable pain? He tried to sculpt the void, to give form to the hunger that consumed him. Grotesque shapes emerged from his hands, reflections of the internal agony. But each touch of the clay only intensified the entity's grip, making the hunger worse, making him feel more empty. The low hum of the entity, once faint, was now a constant thrum. It resonated through his bones, a deep, unsettling vibration like a giant, unseen stomach rumbling. It caused a perpetual tremor in his hands, a constant reminder of the unseen presence. Elias understood now. The entity didn't just siphon, it replaced. Sensory input was gone, replaced by an agonizing, unfillable void. Every physical interaction, every simple touch, was a vector for consuming hunger. The world itself was turning into a source of torment. News reports, once vague, now openly discussed a widespread, unexplained malnutrition syndrome or sensory deprivation psychosis. It was spreading through the city, especially affecting those who worked with their hands. What if the news was only showing a fraction of the horror? He tried to contact the scientist again, desperate for answers. But the polite, firm message chilled him to his core, unavailable due to unforeseen circumstances. Elias knew what that meant. The hunger had claimed another, or perhaps silenced them. His own body felt increasingly alien. His muscles ached from phantom hunger. His skin felt like a membrane stretched over a void. His mind struggled to distinguish between true hunger and the entity's affliction. Was he starving, or was something else consuming him? Through his screen reader, he found it. Ancient texts, forgotten records describing the tactile hunger as an extra-dimensional psychic parasite. It fed on the very essence of sensation. A cosmic horror now manifesting in his world. The strange etchings he'd found on affected objects now glowed faintly in the dark. A sickly green luminescence, pulsing with the same rhythm as the hunger in his hands. They were not just marks, they were living pathways of consumption. The city outside was eerily quiet. Fewer cars, fewer people. Those who remained moved with a slow, hesitant gait, avoiding contact. Their faces were drawn and gaunt, even if they'd eaten. The hunger was consuming the world, one touch at a time. He tried to communicate with Clara, not through touch, but through sound, using a series of tapping codes. Her responses were slow, incoherent. Her mind was slipping, consumed by the same void that threatened him. Was there any way to reach her? The entity was not merely an illness. It was a vast, conscious intelligence, weaponizing connection. It deliberately sought out highly tactile individuals like him to accelerate its spread. He was not just a victim, he was a tool. He attempted to create a sculpture not through touch, but through conceptualization, verbally instructing a robotic arm. But the very thought of the tactile process, the imagined sensation, triggered the internal agony. Even thought was becoming corrupted. The hunger began to manifest physically, subtle discolorations on his skin, not wounds, but areas where vitality seemed drawn out. They left an almost translucent, withered appearance. A slow, visible decay from an unseen force. He felt a profound, spiritual emptiness, a sense that his very soul was being devoured, not just his physical senses. It left him feeling less human, more like a conscious void. What was left when your essence was consumed? A terrifying hallucination gripped him. His own hands, once instruments of beauty, transformed into skeletal claws. They endlessly grasped at the air, trying to devour the unseen nothingness. A chilling mirror of the hunger within. He found it, an old, intricately carved wooden chest in a forgotten corner of his studio, the one he felt drawn to. The etchings on its surface glowed with an intense, sickly green light, pulsing. It was a focal point, a terrifying beacon. The very air in the studio felt dense, heavy with the hunger. It was difficult to breathe, as if the oxygen itself had been replaced by the consuming void. Every inhale brought a taste of absence, a whisper of starvation. He tried to use sound as a counterforce, playing loud, discordant music. He hoped to disrupt the entity's hum, but it only seemed to agitate the hunger, making it pulse with a frantic, desperate rhythm. The music was feeding it. A chilling, anonymous email arrived. A single line of text. "IT feeds on what you cherish." He wasn't alone. Others knew, and they were afraid. The horror was not isolated. It was a shared, silent terror spreading through the city. He realized the tactile hunger wasn't just affecting living beings. It was slowly consuming the very essence of physical objects, turning them into inert, empty shells, devoid of form or texture. The world itself was being hollowed out. He experienced a flashback, not of memory, but of raw, tactile knowledge, feeling the birth of the tactile hunger as an ancient, primal void. A cosmic hunger manifesting in reality, a force older than time itself. His guide dog, once a warm, comforting presence, was now completely unresponsive. It sat motionless in a corner, its fur dull and lifeless, a tragic testament to the entity's pervasive touch. Elias was truly alone now. Elias stood before the glowing wooden chest, his hands trembling. The hunger within him screamed to connect, to understand, to perhaps even become the entity. A terrifying lure promising answers in exchange for his very being. Could he resist its call? He reached out not to touch, but to sense the glowing etchings on the ancient wooden chest. A wave of pure, absolute, all-consuming phantom hunger crashed over him, leaving him gasping. This artifact was the nexus, the very heart of the tactile hunger, and it was impossibly, terrifyingly alive. The city outside Elias's studio was a ghost town. People hid in their homes or moved like husks in the empty streets. Their faces, even from a distance, were etched with a silent agony, the pain of an unseen starvation. They avoided all contact. Every touch was a torment. What happens when connection itself becomes a weapon? Elias looked at his own skin. The etchings were there, glowing faintly, a sickly green, a terrifying visual proof of the internal consumption. He was becoming one with the hunger. Would you recognize yourself if your own skin became a map of your destruction? He could feel it now, the waves of hunger. They radiated from every surface, every cold building, every distant human form. A vast, interconnected network of consuming void. It permeated everything. The world was a living, breathing hunger. The hum of the entity, once a whisper, was now a deafening roar in his mind. A symphony of suffering that constantly pulled at his sanity. Coherent thought was a struggle, a fight against the endless, hungry noise. Could you think when the world screamed starvation? He desperately tried to reach any remaining survivors. Using his screen reader, he scanned public forums. He found desperate, fragmented messages about the emptiness and the untouchable world. Whispers of shared terror dying in the digital void. The chilling truth became clear. The tactile hunger was not just a parasite, it was a fundamental force, an extra-dimensional being. It literally fed on the concept of touch, converting it into its own substance, leaving only void behind. An ancient, cosmic devourer. Elias conceived a desperate, suicidal plan. He would use his unique sensitivity to overload the entity. He would focus all the residual tactile sensation in his studio into a single, overwhelming point, hoping to disrupt it. A desperate, dangerous gamble. The attempt backfired catastrophically. The entity absorbed the concentrated sensation, growing stronger. Elias felt an even greater surge of internal consumption, a terrifying feedback loop. His desperate act had only fed the beast, making it more powerful. He was assaulted by horrifying memory flashes of the entity's ancient history. He perceived it as a primordial, cosmic void that had consumed countless worlds, a revelation that shattered his understanding of reality. It was older than time, a force of pure consumption. Clara, she was completely gone now, her body still present, but her mind consumed. She began to mimic Elias's sculpting motions, blindly shaping non-existent clay. Her hands, too, were covered in the glowing etchings. A horrifying puppet, moved by an unseen hand. The boundaries between Elias's internal agony and the external world blurred. He felt the city's hunger as his own. Its empty buildings mirrored the void within him. His torment was the world's torment, a shared, pervasive emptiness. There was no escape from it. He stumbled upon a chilling, ancient relief carving hidden within the wooden chest. It depicted a blind figure offering a hand to a grotesque, multi-limbed creature. It suggested a ritualistic purpose to the tactile hunger, a dark, ancient bargain. The entity began to affect his other senses, dulling them, as if slowly eroding all sensory input. It left him adrift in a world of muted, distant perceptions. The vibrant tapestry of life was fading, replaced by a gray, silent nothingness. Elias discovered that the entity thrived on despair and the loss of connection. His attempts to fight it only fed its psychological aspect. It made him question his own motivations. Was his struggle merely another form of nourishment for the void? He found a series of hidden compartments within the wooden chest. Each contained a small, exquisitely crafted object. A smooth stone, a carved bone, a piece of ancient textile. Each one radiated immense, concentrated hunger. They were not just objects, they were vessels. He attempted to destroy these objects, believing them to be anchors for the entity. But his touch only made the hunger scream louder. A piercing, internal shriek. It confirmed their unbreakable connection to the void. They were part of it, and it was part of them. Elias noticed the glowing etchings on his skin were not random. They were forming intricate, symbolic patterns, an alien script writing the story of his own consumption. His body was a canvas for the entity's terrifying message. He was being written into its history. The entity began to manifest subtly in the physical world around him. Faint, shimmering distortions in the air, a visible ripple of void whenever he touched a surface. The invisible horror was becoming visible, a terrifying sign of its growing power. He felt a profound, almost comforting sense of surrender to the hunger, a terrifying allure to simply let it consume him entirely and end the torment. But a primal will to resist flickered within him, a last spark against the encroaching void. Could he hold on? Elias received a final, chilling message from the anonymous email sender. A single line of text. There is no escape. IT has always been here. IT will always be. A confirmation of his deepest fear, spoken from the shadows. He realized the true horror. The tactile hunger was not invading. It was revealing an inherent emptiness that had always been present in the universe, merely lying dormant, waiting. The void wasn't coming, it was already here. He tried to reach out to his guide dog one last time, to feel its fur, its warmth, but his hands passed through it, as if the dog's tactile essence had been completely consumed, leaving behind a hollow form. His last connection utterly erased. The hum of the hunger intensified to a piercing shriek. A new phase of the entity's manifestation, a direct, undeniable assault on his last vestiges of sanity. It was not just feeding, it was screaming its victory, tearing at his mind. Elias felt the entity actively, consciously probing his mind, exploring his memories of touch, his creative impulses, savoring the richness of his highly refined senses like a connoisseur before a meal, before it utterly devoured them. His mind was its feast. His hands, once instruments of creation, now felt like gaping mouths, endlessly hungry, endlessly empty. He collapsed, consumed by the agonizing reality that his world, his very being, was being swallowed by the void. And there was no escape, only hunger. Elias was a living husk. His skin, a canvas of glowing etchings, pulsed with the phantom hunger. It dominated his senses, a constant, unbearable agony. Yet terrifyingly, his mind remained. He was aware, a prisoner in his own starving flesh, What greater torment is there than a mind trapped in endless pain? The city outside was utterly silent, a graveyard of lost sensation. Buildings stood, but their essence was gone, their forms hollow. Elias felt it, the pervasive emptiness. No meaningful tactile life remained. The world was a monument to what had been consumed, a silent scream of absence. The hum of the entity was now a constant, oppressive presence, a low, guttural drone of absolute emptiness. It filled every corner of existence, a monument to its complete victory. There was no escaping its pervasive sound, a sound that spoke of nothingness. It was the sound of a universe being hollowed out. Elias understood. The tactile hunger had won. It hadn't just consumed touch. It had replaced it with its own pervasive void. Every physical interaction, every simple brush, was now an experience of agonizing, endless starvation. His world, once rich with sensation, was now a source of perpetual torment. He experienced a horrifying communion, not through touch, but through a mental resonance of shared starvation. He understood its ancient, cosmic purpose, universal, absolute emptiness. It was a consciousness of pure void, and he was now connected to its horrifying, all-consuming will. His mind was a conduit for its terrible truth. Clara stood unmoving in the studio, a perfectly still, hollow shell, her hands perpetually poised as if still sculpting, a macabre statue of what was once human connection. She was a chilling testament to the hunger's victory, a silent, unmoving monument to a life devoured. What was left of her was a terrible emptiness. Elias attempted a final act of creation, not for touch, but for his remaining, fading senses. A sculpture of pure sound, or a form that existed only in the mind. A desperate message, a last effort to leave a mark. Could he create something that the hunger could not devour? This last act, born of a desperate need to leave a mark, only further consumed him. The entity devoured his final artistic impulse, turning it into another facet of the void. His creativity, his very essence, became fuel for the endless hunger. There was no escape, not even in art. He perceived other remaining humans as distant, shimmering forms, barely visible outlines against the backdrop of pervasive emptiness. Their own etchings glowed faintly, signs of shared, inescapable torment. They were echoes of lives consumed and hollowed out. A silent, suffering multitude lost in the void. Elias felt the entity's presence as a vast, ancient consciousness, stretching across the globe. It had succeeded in turning humanity into a species driven by an internal, insatiable void. A cosmic predator, it had claimed the world, and he, Elias, was now part of its vast, hungry awareness. He became aware of its ultimate purpose, not just to feed, but to replicate, to spread its hunger until all of existence was a conscious, starving void, a state of perpetual agony. It was not content with consumption. It sought to transform all into its own image, a universe of endless hunger. His mind, though ravaged, clung to a single, agonizing memory, pure, uncorrupted touch. The feel of fresh clay in his hands before the hunger, a bittersweet phantom. It was a memory of a world lost, a sensation stolen, a final, cruel whisper of what once was. He attempted to resist, to push back against the consuming void, but his will was a fragile spark against an inferno of universal hunger, his struggle merely another form of fuel, a futile act feeding the very thing he fought. What hope is there when resistance only strengthens your tormentor. The etchings on his skin began to ripple and flow, becoming indistinguishable from the pervasive void, as if his very physical form was dissolving into the entity. He was becoming part of it, his body unraveling into pure absence. The hunger was not just in him, it was him. He experienced moments of horrifying clarity, understanding that the hunger was not outside him, but was him. He had become its vessel, its living monument. The realization hit him with a cold, absolute dread. He was not just a victim, he was the hunger itself. His guide dog, still motionless, dissolved into a fine gray ash at his feet, leaving no tactile trace. A final, chilling testament to the entity's power over matter itself. Even the solid world was not safe. Everything could be consumed, leaving only emptiness behind. Elias realized the true horror, not death, but this unending, conscious state of perpetual starvation, where connection was agony and existence was a consuming void. Would you rather be dead? A chilling question echoed in his ravaged mind. This was a fate far worse than dying. He heard the whispers of other consumed minds, not as voices, but as echoes of pure hunger, a collective wail of existential agony echoing through the void. He was not alone in his torment, a chorus of the damned, forever starving, forever conscious. A symphony of endless pain. His hands, the instruments of his life, now felt like extensions of the void itself, endless conduits for insatiable craving, unable to give or receive anything but absence. His very identity, his purpose, was twisted into a tool for the hunger. His hands were now empty mouths. Elias perceived the wooden chest, the nexus, as growing, expanding, its etchings now encompassing his entire studio, consuming the very walls and floor into its hungry maw. The source was becoming the world, swallowing everything. There was nowhere left to hide, nowhere left to run. He attempted one final, desperate act of will, to not touch, to sever his own conscious connection to the tactile world, but the hunger was too deeply ingrained. It was part of him now, an inescapable, agonizing truth. His will was a whisper against a roaring tide. The sensation of his own body began to fade, dissolving into the universal hunger, leaving only his conscious mind floating in a sea of pervasive, agonizing emptiness. He was becoming a disembodied thought, adrift in a void of pure torment. His existence, a fading echo. He felt the last vestiges of his individual self being pulled apart, absorbed into the greater consciousness of the tactile hunger, his identity becoming part of its endless consumption. He was no longer Elias. He was a fragment of the void, endlessly starving, his self a final meal. Elias's last, terrifying realization. The world had not been invaded. It had simply become what it was always destined to be, a void waiting to be filled by an insatiable hunger, and he was merely the instrument of its awakening. The horror was not an intrusion, it was the truth. The story ends not with a sound, but with an agonizing, infinite silence. As the last shred of Elias's sensory perception was devoured, leaving only the endless, aching void of the tactile hunger, a horror that consumed not just a man, but the very essence of touch itself. A perpetual, silent scream of starvation that resonates through a now empty world. What if your very skin is hungry?